In a world scarred by the greatest war in history, stories still lie buried, beneath rubble, beneath silence, beneath time itself. Welcome to WWW2 Rewired, a cinematic journey through the untold human side of World War II. Here, we go beyond the battles, beyond the tanks, the generals, the headlines. We uncover the moments when humanity flickered. In the trenches, in the hospitals, in the hearts of those who fought and those who simply endured. Every episode rewires how we see the war, not as history written by victors, but as truth witnessed by survivors. Real documents, real voices, real history, brought to life. Subscribe and step into the stories that changed the world. One act of courage, one act of mercy, at a time. This is WW2 Rewired, where history breathes again. May 1945, southern Germany. The wind carried the faint smell of smoke and damp earth across the foothills of Bavaria. The war was over, yet for many, peace had not begun. A line of exhausted German nurses trudged down a narrow country road, their white armbands soiled, their eyes hollow from nights without sleep. Behind them, the sound of distant artillery still echoed like ghosts refusing to die. Each woman clutched what little she owned: a folded medical pouch, a rosary, a photograph wrapped in cloth. They had been told the Americans were monsters. That capture meant humiliation, perhaps worse. But when they reached the checkpoint outside Regensburg, the guards did not shout. They did not strike. An American sergeant simply raised his hand and ordered food brought out from the field kitchen. The nurses froze in disbelief, their hunger overtaken by confusion. One whispered, "Why are they being kind to us?" What they could not yet know was that this moment, quiet, humane, and almost unreal, marked the beginning of a moral contrast that would echo through post-war Europe. Context, background, section, taunter. By the spring of 1945, the world had become a graveyard of nations. The Third Reich, once stretching from the Atlantic to the Volga, was collapsing under the combined weight of Allied firepower and its own delusions. Cities that had once echoed with parades and anthems now lay in ruins. Berlin was a maze of rubble and smoke. The swastika that once flew over Europe was burning out, one black ember at a time. But amidst the military collapse, another army was falling apart: the medical corps of Nazi Germany. Tens of thousands of doctors, medics, and nurses, once stationed near the front, were suddenly caught between surrender and survival. For them, the war's end did not bring celebration. It brought confusion, captivity, and fear of the unknown. In late April, as American armored divisions cut deep into Bavaria, German field hospitals began to empty. Ambulances were abandoned. Makeshift triage tents became grave sites. Some nurses burned patient files to prevent them from falling into Allied hands, believing that capture would mean execution. They had been taught, after all, that the enemy had no mercy. The Nazi propaganda machine had long painted a monstrous picture of the Americans. Posters showed Allied soldiers as barbaric invaders who mutilated prisoners and desecrated women. State radio broadcasts warned that surrender meant dishonor and abuse. For German women serving in uniform, particularly nurses, this fear ran deeper than logic. They were trained to heal, not to fight, and yet now they expected punishment simply for doing their duty under Hitler's command. On the other side, the advancing U.S. Army had strict orders, not of vengeance, but of control. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, had made it clear: no acts of retribution. Maintain discipline. Show them who we are by what we do. It was a command rooted not in sentiment, but in calculation. The Americans knew that the war's moral legacy would depend on how they treated those who had once served the Nazi regime. When U.S. units entered southern Germany, they encountered a broken nation. Convoys of civilians, soldiers, and medical personnel streamed along every road, surrendering in waves. Among them were the nurses, often from the Bund Deutscher Mädels Auxiliary Corps or the Wehrmacht's medical service, wearing faded gray uniforms and Red Cross armbands. They were young, most in their 20s, trained in sterilization, field surgery, and the care of the wounded under bombardment. Many had seen horrors no one could unsee. In early May, near Regensburg, one such group, 50 nurses from a field hospital, surrendered to the 11th Armored Division. The Americans were stunned. Instead of the hardened Nazi image they'd been fed by their own wartime propaganda, they found frightened, starving young women, clutching bandages and field kits like shields. For the Americans, the capture of German medical personnel posed a new dilemma. Under the Geneva Convention, nurses and doctors were considered non-combatants. They were to be treated as prisoners of war, but also afforded certain rights: the ability to continue practicing medicine under supervision and protection from mistreatment. For the Germans, however, this distinction seemed impossible to believe. They had grown up in a culture where mercy was weakness and obedience was survival. As the days turned into weeks, camps were established throughout Bavaria and Hesse. These were not concentration camps, though the fear in the minds of those captured made little distinction at first. They were orderly, guarded, and supplied. American soldiers were under strict instruction to provide rations, medical care, and respect to all detainees, regardless of gender or rank. Yet, for the German nurses, this treatment was incomprehensible. In their world, the defeated were humiliated. The weak were despised. The idea that a victorious army could act with restraint was alien. Many wept in silence, believing it was only a temporary deception. But the deception never came. Day after day, American guards brought food. They offered cigarettes. They spoke calmly. Some even addressed the nurses as Miss or Ma'am. It was not kindness in the modern sense. It was discipline, professionalism, and a belief in something larger than revenge. What unfolded in those first weeks of surrender would become a quiet moral experiment, one that tested the character of both the captors and the captured. And as the fog of war lifted over Europe, in Outstörten aus die Fieber ein Studitor trained that fragile peace inside the camps began to reveal deeper truths about what humanity could survive after total destruction. Context, Chapter 3, Background. Section 2T. The surrender of Nazi Germany was not a moment of order. It was a wave of chaos breaking across a ruined continent. In May 1945, millions of German soldiers, doctors, and civilians flooded the Allied zones seeking safety from both the Red Army and starvation. Among them were thousands of nurses, women who had spent years working in field hospitals near the front lines of France, Italy, and the Eastern Front. They arrived in waves, exhausted, malnourished, clutching their Red Cross documents like shields. Some wore improvised uniforms, others still carried surgical tools wrapped in rags. They expected interrogation, punishment, or worse. But when they entered American custody, what awaited them was something they could not have imagined. Structure. The U.S. military's occupation policy was built not on vengeance, but on discipline and the preservation of order. The U.S. Army Medical Corps and military government divisions had prepared for this long before the surrender. Their mandate was clear: treat every captured person under the Geneva Convention, provide humane conditions, and maintain strict moral authority in the face of German collapse. Across southern Germany, temporary prisoner-of-war enclosures, called transient camps, were established. The camps outside Regensburg, Nuremberg, and Heilbronn were among the first to hold captured Wehrmacht medics and nurses. Barbed wire encircled them, but inside, there was an unexpected calm. American medical officers organized triage posts, issued blankets, and screened prisoners for disease. Captain Harold B. Wilson of the U.S. Army Medical Corps wrote in his report from June 1945, "Most of the women we received were underweight, frightened, and still wearing blood-stained field tunics. Their discipline was remarkable, their fear even more so. They refused to eat at first, believing we would poison them. It took days before trust began to show in their eyes. For the Americans, the nurses represented a test, a chance to prove that the ideals they claimed to fight for could survive even after victory. For the Germans, it was the first glimpse of a world that did not revolve around hatred or hierarchy. Inside the camps, daily life was strict but predictable. Each morning, roll call was followed by medical checks and meal distribution. The nurses were often asked to assist in tending to other German prisoners, many of whom were suffering from infected wounds, frostbite, and malnutrition. For the first time, the line between captor and captive blurred. American doctors and German nurses stood side by side over the same stretchers. In many camps, German medical staff were allowed to organize infirmaries. American supervision remained constant, but the initiative often came from the nurses themselves, determined to maintain some fragment of professional identity in the aftermath of defeat. They washed bandages, sterilized tools, and administered morphine, this time not for the Reich, but for survival. Letters and diary fragments recovered decades later reveal the deep shock many of these women felt at their treatment. One nurse from Stuttgart, identified only as ML, wrote in May 1945, "The guards smile at us. They say, 'Good morning.' I had not heard those words without fear in years. I do not understand them. I do not trust them. But I am grateful, and it confuses me." The cultural gap between the two sides was immense. The Americans, many barely in their 20s, were products of a democratic society that prized individual worth and professionalism. The Germans, shaped by years of authoritarian control and propaganda, believed respect was something one earned through rank or fear. The simple decency of being addressed politely was disorienting. At the same time, the American approach was not purely sentimental. It was strategic. The U.S. High Command understood that the moral image of the occupying forces would influence the reconstruction of Europe. Germany was to be re-educated, not destroyed. Each humane act toward a prisoner or civilian was a small, deliberate act of diplomacy. By the end of 1945, reports from multiple camps confirmed the same pattern. Cooperation grew where cruelty had been expected. German medical personnel became instrumental in stabilizing the civilian population, treating both fellow prisoners and displaced persons. Their skill, discipline, and endurance made them invaluable in preventing disease outbreaks and maintaining order. Yet, beneath that cooperation lay something quieter, a moral awakening. For the nurses, the respect they received from their former enemies forced them to question everything they had been taught. The war had ended, but the battle for truth had just begun. And as dawns rose over the makeshift barracks of Bavaria, many of them began to realize that perhaps mercy, not victory, was the true mark of civilization. Angles, Section 11. The human angle, fear, dignity, and the shattering of illusions. When the guns fell silent, silence itself became the most frightening sound. For the German nurses, the end of war did not mean freedom. It meant judgment. They had served the Wehrmacht, tended to wounded soldiers, and witnessed the destruction of cities they once called home. Now, they were prisoners of the victors they had been taught to fear. Many of them had lived for years under a regime that stripped compassion from language. Orders were absolute. Emotions were weakness. They had learned to obey, to survive, and to suppress empathy when the system demanded it. When these women walked into American custody, they carried not just fatigue, but a lifetime of indoctrination, the belief that mercy was a lie. But inside the U.S. camps, the rules were different. American guards enforced discipline without cruelty. Food was distributed fairly. Medical care was provided even to those who had once served the Nazi cause. The result was something more profound than physical safety. It was moral disorientation. A former nurse, interviewed in 1989 for a German oral history project, recalled, "When they handed us bread, I cried. Not because I was hungry, but because I realized I had been lied to. For years they told us the Americans were animals, but they were the first people to treat me as a human being." The human angle of this story is not one of redemption, but of confrontation. These nurses were forced to face the collapse of everything they believed. And in that collapse, they found a fragile kind of peace. One born not from victory, but from decency. The propaganda angle, breaking the wall of fear for 12 years, Nazi propaganda had poisoned every idea of the outside world. From newsreels to medical training lectures, German citizens were taught that the Allies sought nothing less than the annihilation of the German people. For nurses, the fear was doubled, as women and as uniformed personnel. In classrooms, instructors repeated that if captured, Allied soldiers would assault or kill them. This fear was no accident, it was a weapon. By convincing women that surrender meant degradation, the Nazi regime ensured loyalty until the very end. But when American guards behaved with civility, when they said "Guten Morgen" instead of insults, when they allowed women to rest before processing, when they shared food, that wall of fear began to crumble. Propaganda collapsed faster than any front line. A U.S. intelligence report from June 1945 noted, "Prisoners appeared genuinely surprised by the conduct of our personnel. They were certain of brutality. Instead, they find organization and fairness. Their morale improves rapidly." The American military understood that this surprise was powerful. It was psychological warfare in reverse, defeating hatred, not with violence, but with humanity. It undermined the very mythology that had sustained the Reich. And for the women who had spent their lives serving that myth, the experience was transformative. Many later said that the first days in U.S. custody were the moment they began to question everything: their government, their faith in authority, and even their understanding of right and wrong. The moral angle, the conduct of the victors for the United States Army, the treatment of German prisoners was not merely a legal requirement, it was a statement of identity. America had entered the war claiming to fight for civilization against tyranny. That claim meant little if victory was accompanied by cruelty. Military law demanded that all POWs be treated according to the Geneva Convention of 1929. But the moral discipline that followed came from leadership. Officers repeatedly reminded their men that they represented more than a flag. They represented an idea. Lieutenant Colonel Frank P. Armstrong wrote in his 1945 memorandum to his regiment, "You are soldiers of the United States. You will not act as conquerors. You will act as guardians of order. Every act of fairness is a blow against the evil we defeated." In practice, this meant that American guards were forbidden from mocking, harassing, or abusing prisoners, including women who had worn the Nazi eagle. It also meant accountability. Soldiers caught mistreating captives could face court-martial. This discipline was not universal. Isolated incidents of violence and retribution did occur. But overall, the conduct in the southern occupation zones remained remarkably restrained. For every story of vengeance, there were dozens of small, silent acts of restraint. For the nurses, this restraint carried moral weight. They had grown up in a system where obedience was demanded by fear. To see authority exercised through fairness was almost incomprehensible. It revealed the possibility that power did not need to destroy to prove itself. That realization would echo long after the war's end, shaping how many former nurses later spoke of their captivity, not as humiliation, but as a strange form of liberation. At the heart of these three angles lies a simple paradox. The victors won by refusing to act like victors. The nurses expected cruelty. What they received was order, respect, and a quiet dignity that neither side had known for years. It was this contrast between indoctrinated fear and unexpected humanity that set the stage for a transformation deeper than any battlefield victory. Angles, Section 24. The medical ethics angle. Healing in the shadow of defeat in war. Medicine is supposed to remain neutral, but under the Third Reich, neutrality was a myth. German nurses and doctors had been forced to serve not just the wounded, but the ideology of racial purity. In some hospitals, Jewish patients were segregated or denied care entirely. On the Eastern Front, nurses were ordered to treat German soldiers first, leaving Soviet captives to die untreated. For many, following those orders became second nature. Now, in American custody, those same women were asked to tend to all the sick, regardless of nationality, uniform, or cause. The shift was more than medical, it was moral. American officers noticed it immediately. Reports from the 5th U.S. Army Medical Detachment in mid-1945 recorded. Former German nurses displayed discipline and technical skill. However, many expressed disbelief at the equal treatment of all patients. The idea that medicine could serve humanity rather than the state seemed alien. In the makeshift infirmaries of Regensburg and Augsburg, American and German medical personnel worked side by side. A wounded German soldier might receive a blood transfusion prepared by his former enemy. A displaced Polish civilian might be treated by a German nurse under American supervision. These moments did not erase the past, but they began to heal it, quietly, one patient at a time. For some nurses, it was their first exposure to the true spirit of the Hippocratic Oath. They began to rediscover why they had joined medicine in the first place, not for nationalism, but for compassion. In a post-war interview from 1947, one nurse said, "When I saw an American doctor treat a wounded German without hatred, I understood what medicine was meant to be. It was not about nations. It was about people." This reawakening of conscience would become a seed, one that would later influence the rebuilding of Germany's post-war medical ethics and humanitarian outlook. The gender and power angle, women, war, and the unexpected dignity of captivity. The German military machine had used women as tools, efficient, obedient, and replaceable. Nurses were expected to embody discipline and purity, yet they were denied authority and autonomy. They were part of the war effort, but invisible within it. Captivity, ironically, changed that. In U.S. custody, gender norms shifted in unexpected ways. American guards, bound by regulation and culture, were forbidden to harass or fraternize with female prisoners. This rule, strictly enforced, created a strange kind of respect. The women, for the first time, found themselves treated not as subordinates or property, but as professionals and human beings. One American officer's diary entry from May 1945 recorded, "They look at us as if waiting for the blow that never comes. When we treat them normally, they do not know how to respond. It is as if they have forgotten what normal is. That normal, the basic decency of mutual respect, became revolutionary in its quiet power. For women who had spent years obeying male superiors under authoritarian command, this civility felt radical. It was not equality, but it was dignity. And dignity, after years of propaganda and fear, felt like freedom. The experience changed how many of these women viewed power itself. In post-war testimonies, several nurses expressed that they began to see strength not in domination, but in restraint. One wrote, "They had the guns. We had nothing. And yet, they never used that power to humiliate us. That was strength I had never known before." In a time when gender, politics, and brutality intertwined, the simple act of respect became an act of quiet revolution. The cultural clash angle. Two worlds collide. Encounters between American soldiers and German nurses revealed two civilizations meeting not on the battlefield, but in the small rituals of everyday life. To the Germans, the Americans seemed undisciplined, laughing, informal, chewing gum while standing guard. To the Americans, the Germans appeared rigid and emotionally distant. Yet beneath these cultural contrasts lay something deeper, a mutual fascination with the humanity of the other side. Language barriers forced both groups into gestures rather than words. A nod, a shared cigarette, a helping hand with medical equipment. Slowly, these gestures began to replace fear. In one camp, American guards nicknamed the German nurses the White Angels, not mockingly, but out of respect for their tireless work among wounded prisoners. Some of the nurses even began teaching English phrases in exchange for soap or extra rations. It was a small, fragile bridge between two worlds that had been taught to hate each other. In those small exchanges, a smile, a translation, a shared laugh, something extraordinary occurred. Empathy without agenda. American guards learned that the women they had been told were Nazi loyalists were, in fact, terrified professionals who had been trapped by the same machinery of war. The nurses discovered that their supposed enemies were young men far from home, just as weary, just as eager to return to a normal life. The camp became, for a brief moment, a mirror reflecting not nationalities, but humanity stripped of propaganda. By the summer of 1945, these interactions had transformed the emotional climate of many camps. Suspicion gave way to cooperation, fear to mutual recognition. The women who once expected punishment now volunteered for medical duty. The men who once carried rifles learned that compassion could be as powerful as command. It was a rare, quiet kind of victory. One fought not with bullets, but with understanding. Climax, Turning Point, Section. It was late May 1945. The war in Europe had officially ended, but in a small American-administered camp near Regensburg, the war's moral reckoning was still unfolding. The camp was surrounded by pine forest and silence, a temporary holding site for German medical personnel awaiting processing. Inside the barbed wire, dozens of nurses worked alongside American doctors to tend to a flood of wounded German POWs. Some men had been pulled from collapsed bunkers, others from the roads during the chaotic surrender. They were emaciated, feverish, their uniforms hanging like rags. The American guards could have ignored them. Instead, they ordered the infirmary expanded, providing supplies, morphine, sulfa drugs, bandages, all marked U.S. Army. For the German nurses, the sight of those boxes was surreal. They had spent years hearing that American medicine was primitive, that the Allies cared nothing for suffering. Yet here they were, holding vials stamped with stars and stripes, using them to save German lives. Among them was Sister Ilse Becker, a 27-year-old nurse from Dresden. She had survived the firebombing of her city and fled west with a field unit just before the Soviet advance. When captured, she expected humiliation. Instead, she was asked by a U.S. captain to help run a recovery ward. For the first time in years, she could simply do her job. No politics, no slogans, just patience. In her diary, discovered decades later and preserved in the archives of the Bundesarchiv Koblenz, Ilse wrote, "They gave us food before asking questions. They called me Miss Becker. I do not know if I am dreaming. Every order is polite. It feels dangerous to trust them, but I cannot help it." That week, the camp faced its greatest test. A group of captured German soldiers arrived from a bombed convoy, many suffering from burns and gas exposure. The nurses immediately requested permission to assist. The U.S. guards, following protocol, initially refused. Prisoners were not to handle chemicals or open wounds without supervision. But when an American lieutenant saw the chaos in the triage tent, patients gasping, nurses shouting for help, he made a decision that defied bureaucracy. He handed Sister Becker the surgical mask and said quietly, "Do what you can." For the next 48 hours, American medics and German nurses worked side by side. The smell of antiseptic filled the air. Lanterns flickered against the tent walls as night fell. There was no language barrier now, only gestures of urgency and exhaustion. An American sergeant named Thomas Reed later wrote to his wife about that night, "They worked like machines. I've never seen such endurance." One of them fainted on her feet, then stood up again before we could stop her. It was as if they were trying to prove something, maybe to us, maybe to themselves. By dawn, dozens of lives had been saved. Several American officers stood watching as the nurses cleaned the last instruments. No orders were given, no speeches made, just quiet acknowledgement. A mutual recognition that something larger than war had happened in that tent. The next morning, the nurses were called to assembly. They expected reprimand for breaking camp rules. Instead, the commanding officer addressed them through a translator. "You served with honor last night. You showed courage and skill. The United States Army thanks you." There was no applause, only stunned silence. One woman began to cry openly, the kind of tears that come when fear finally leaves the body. For the first time, these nurses were treated not as enemies, not as prisoners, but as professionals. It was a moment of moral inversion, when captives found dignity and victors found humility. This night would later become known among the camp's soldiers as the Night of White Hands, because in that sea of khaki and olive drab, it was the moral temperature of the war had shifted. But deeper transformations were still to come, as respect gave way to trust, and trust gave birth to something even more enduring: understanding. Climax, turning point. Section 2, in the weeks that followed. The Night of White Hands, something remarkable began to unfold inside the camp. The nurses who had arrived, terrified, certain of abuse or punishment, now carried themselves differently. Their posture changed. They walked with a quiet purpose, spoke with calm, and began volunteering for tasks beyond their assigned duties. They had entered captivity as servants of a defeated empire. They were now, in small ways, becoming symbols of moral recovery. The American officers noticed the change. A field report from the U.S. Army's Civil Affairs Division, dated June 1945, described the transformation in measured tones. German medical personnel under our supervision show a notable shift in attitude. Hostility has declined. Their work is efficient and disciplined. They express gratitude, often disbelief, at fair treatment. Trust appears to be replacing fear. Trust. That was the real turning point. Not the signing of surrender documents or the lowering of flags, but the simple human act of believing that mercy was possible. Each morning, nurses lined up for roll call beside American guards who had once been told to expect resistance. Now they exchanged greetings. The boundaries of war, uniform, nationality, propaganda, began to dissolve within the routines of care. One of the most telling moments came a few days after the field hospital incident. A convoy of newly liberated Allied POWs, emaciated British and French soldiers, was brought into the camp for temporary medical evaluation. They had survived years in German captivity and carried the emotional scars of starvation and neglect. When they saw German nurses approaching their beds, many recoiled in instinctive hatred. An American officer intervened, explaining through translators that these women were under U.S. protection and that they had been helping treat wounded prisoners regardless of nationality. One British sergeant, pale and trembling, stared at the nurse tending his arm wound. Her uniform still bore the faded insignia of the Wehrmacht. He muttered, "I never thought I'd live to see this." That afternoon, the same nurse, Sister Becker, shared her soup ration with him. No words were exchanged. None were needed. It was the smallest gesture imaginable. Yet in that moment, Decades of hatred and propaganda quietly broke apart. The transformation was not one-sided. For the American Guards, the experience reshaped their own understanding of victory. They had expected vengeance to feel righteous. Instead, restraint proved more powerful. Many soldiers later wrote that treating their enemies with fairness made them feel they had truly won. A corporal from the 11th Armored Division summarized it best in a letter home. "They taught us something without saying a word. We came to guard them, but they reminded us what we were guarding: our own humanity." It was this moral reciprocity, unspoken, fragile, but undeniable, that defined the real climax of the story. Both sides discovered that compassion could survive even in captivity. The U.S. command's strict enforcement of discipline ensured this atmosphere lasted. Officers repeatedly reminded troops that cruelty would dishonor everything they had fought for. Every cigarette shared, every bandage passed across enemy lines, became a quiet act of defiance against the brutality that had consumed Europe. In those long Bavarian evenings, the nurses sometimes sat outside the barracks, singing softly. Not patriotic songs, but old folk tunes from before the war. American soldiers listened from a distance, some joining in with harmonicas. For a few minutes each night, the sound of human voices replaced the noise of destruction. Years later, one of the guards, Sergeant William Hayes, recalled in an interview, "I remember the first time they laughed. It was like the war ended twice. Once with the surrender, and once when they realized we weren't their enemies." The turning point had not come through speeches or treaties, but through shared exhaustion, the universal fatigue of people who had seen too much death and still chose not to add to it. By the end of June, the U.S. military had begun preparing to transfer the nurses to longer-term facilities or release them to assist in rebuilding German hospitals. But before their departure, the camp commander gathered everyone, guards, doctors, and prisoners alike. Through an interpreter, he said only this: "The world has seen what hate can do. Now it will see what respect can build." Those words were not recorded in any official report, but they remained etched in memory. For the nurses, they marked the end of captivity and the beginning of conscience. They had entered the camp as symbols of a defeated Reich. They left it as witnesses to a truth that war had tried to erase, that mercy is stronger than fear. And though history would not remember their names, their quiet defiance, the choice to heal when the world expected hate, became one of the purest victories of 1945. When the gates of the camp finally opened, they walked out not as prisoners, but as participants in a quiet moral revolution. But what came next? The slow return home, the memory of defeat, and the lasting consequences of those humane days would define how a broken nation began to rebuild its soul. Aftermath. Section 1. By the autumn of 1945, the camps of Bavaria were changing. The chaos of surrender had given way to administration, files, rosters, and repatriation lists. The American military government began the enormous task of returning prisoners to civilian life. For the German nurses, this was a moment filled with mixed emotions: relief, shame, and a strange kind of gratitude. Most of them had lost their homes. Their hospitals were rubble, their families scattered or missing. The only structure that still existed, the only order they knew, was inside those camps, behind American barbed wire. Leaving meant freedom, yes, but also the terrifying question: what now? Before release, each nurse underwent interrogation and classification by Allied officers. Those with proven ties to Nazi medical crimes were detained for war crimes screening. The majority, however, were cleared. Their service, though under the Wehrmacht, had been strictly medical. They were listed as non-political personnel. It was an official phrase, but for many, it felt like absolution. In early 1946, Transport convoys began taking these women back to their home regions. Some were assigned to work in civilian hospitals under Allied supervision, treating displaced persons, orphans, and the endless stream of refugees crossing Germany's shattered countryside. For the first time, they worked in peace. Many continued their duties out of habit, wearing the same gray uniforms with the Nazi insignia torn away. They still sterilized scalpels in boiling water, still moved through wards filled with coughing, feverish bodies. But now, their patients were as likely to be Polish survivors or Allied refugees as fellow Germans. In cities like Stuttgart, Würzburg, and Frankfurt, American authorities made use of their skills. The U.S. Army Medical Department reported in 1946 the contribution of former German medical staff, particularly nurses, has proven invaluable in maintaining hygiene and treating civilians. Their discipline and technical ability are exceptional. This cooperation, unthinkable just a year earlier, became one of the quiet foundations of Germany's physical and moral reconstruction. In the ruins of hospitals once marked by swastikas, the same women who had tended Nazi soldiers now dressed the wounds of Jewish survivors. It was not redemption, but it was responsibility. One of the returning nurses, identified as Anna Müller, later gave a testimony to a German Red Cross interviewer in 1951. Her words were simple: "I could never undo what I had seen, but I could choose every day to be different." The Americans taught me that kindness is not weakness. It is strength used wisely. For many, that lesson remained the most enduring gift of their captivity. Not all reintegration was easy. Some faced hostility from their own communities, accused of collaboration or weakness for having served the enemy. Others struggled with guilt, not for crimes they had committed, but for the obedience they had once given so easily. The Allied occupation authorities encouraged education programs for these returning nurses, offering training in ethics, modern hygiene, and medical research. It was the beginning of a new era in German healthcare, one rooted not in ideology, but in international standards of humanity. In a symbolic act of reconciliation, the U.S. Army Medical Corps donated surplus supplies to German hospitals in 1946, many staffed by these very same nurses. The gesture went largely unnoticed by the world, but to those who remembered the fear of May 1945, it meant everything. For Sister Ilse Becker, whose diary would later help historians understand this period, the return to civilian life was bittersweet. She never forgot the night when American soldiers thanked her instead of condemning her. In her final diary entry before returning home, she wrote, "They did not break us. They showed us how to stand without hate." The war had stripped these women of their country, their faith in leadership, and often their families. But in that vacuum, something enduring had taken root. A belief in human decency born from the most unlikely source: captivity itself. The quiet dignity of their return marked not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a new moral order, one that would shape the conscience of post-war Europe. Aftermath. Section 2. In the years that followed, the story of the German nurses faded quietly into the background of post-war history. The headlines celebrated the Nuremberg trials, the Marshall Plan, and the rebuilding of nations, but in small villages and hospital corridors across Germany, a quieter kind of reconstruction was taking place. It was carried not by politicians or generals, but by women who had seen the worst of war and still chose to heal. While Soviet captivity often descended into brutality and revenge, the American zones became places where the ethics of war were being rewritten. The difference was not just political, it was human. Reports from 1946 and 1947 described the vast gulf between the fates of those who surrendered to the Western Allies and those captured in the East. In the Soviet camps, thousands of nurses vanished without record. In the U.S. zones, most were released within a year, Some even retained for essential medical work. Historians would later call this the moral frontier, a border not of land, but of conscience. On one side, punishment without justice. On the other, justice tempered by restraint. That restraint did not excuse the crimes of Nazi Germany, but it set a precedent for what civilization must mean even after apocalypse. For the American soldiers, too, those brief months in the camps left lasting impressions. Letters and memoirs written years later reveal an enduring respect for the German women they once guarded. Private Harold Jensen, who served as a camp medic, wrote in 1952, "When I think of the war, I don't remember the battles. I remember the nurses. They were our prisoners, yet they worked beside us, as if the war had never happened. It made me realize that decency isn't national. It's a choice." For the nurses, captivity had stripped away illusions. They had grown up believing in hierarchy, obedience, and the inevitability of German superiority. What they discovered instead was that dignity could survive only through compassion. That realization would go on to shape generations. Some of the former nurses went on to teach in newly rebuilt hospitals under the Allied-supervised Deutsche Rote Kreuz, German Red Cross. They trained young women not in slogans, but in ethics. "Every patient is a human being first," became their quiet creed. A phrase rooted not in textbooks, but in memory. One nurse, interviewed in 1963 for a West German radio program, put it simply, "They could have treated us as animals. They did not. That is why we became human again." Their testimony, scattered in letters and interviews, became fragments of a forgotten chapter, a story overshadowed by the larger narrative of victory and defeat. Yet, to those who lived it, those small acts of respect were more powerful than any flag or treaty. The irony was haunting. In the ruins of a nation built on cruelty, the first lessons of compassion came from the hands of its conquerors. By the 1950s, Germany's healthcare system was once again functioning, rebuilt on new principles. The nurses, who had once served in uniform, now worked in maternity wards, clinics, and rehabilitation centers. Many never spoke publicly of their captivity, fearing stigma or disbelief. But the values they carried, discipline without fanaticism, compassion without weakness, became part of the new moral DNA of post-war Europe. American officials, reflecting, years later, recognized this outcome as one of the quiet triumphs of the occupation. It was proof that moral leadership could achieve what violence never could: transformation. The world would remember Hiroshima, Berlin, and Nuremberg, but in the shadows of that history, a smaller truth endured: that even in the ashes of total war, respect could rebuild what hatred destroyed. In one of her last surviving letters, Sister Ilse Becker wrote to an American officer she had worked beside, "You showed us mercy when we deserved none. I will teach my children that this is how nations must win, not with fear, but with fairness." And with that simple conviction, the story came full circle. From war to conscience, from defeat to dignity. For the German nurses who once trembled before their captors, the greatest victory was not survival. It was learning that respect could outlive war itself. Reflection. Closure history often remembers wars through their battles, the gunfire, the maps, the flags. But true change rarely happens in the noise. It happens in the quiet moments, when the killing stops, and people must decide what kind of world will rise from the ruins. The story of the German nurses and their American guards is one of those moments. It is not about victory or surrender, but about the rediscovery of humanity when the world had forgotten what that word meant. In 1945, both sides carried ghosts. The Americans with their memories of fallen comrades, the Germans with the shame of a shattered nation. Yet, When they stood face to face, something unexpected emerged. Respect. The kind that does not erase guilt, but transcends it. These women had been instruments of a system that glorified obedience and erased compassion. But in captivity, they encountered an idea more powerful than any ideology, that mercy could exist without weakness, and strength could exist without cruelty. For the Americans, their restraint was not passive. It was deliberate, an assertion that civilization must mean more than conquest, that even in victory, one must remain human. And for the nurses, it was a rebirth of conscience. They had lived through a regime that taught fear as law. In those camps, they learned a different kind of order, one built on fairness, discipline, and decency. Decades later, when historians looked back on the ruins of 1945, they saw more than rubble. They saw the small lights that refused to go out, the medics who treated enemies, the guards who refused to hate, the nurses who learned that healing could be stronger than war, because in the end, civilization is not measured by how fiercely we fight, but by how gently we choose to treat the defeated. The German nurses who couldn't believe they were treated with respect discovered a truth that outlasted every empire, that the greatest victory in war is not domination, it is restraint.